Hello everyone, welcome to From Nowhere to Nothing, Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology, and with me today is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. If there's a topic you'd like us to cover on the show, feel free to email us at fromnowhereto-nothingpodcast@gmail.com or contact us on our Facebook page. Last week, we looked at the life and works of Michel de Montaigne. If you haven't listened to that episode yet, we suggest you go back and check it out, since it is the first of a 4-part series. We continue our discussion by examining a philosopher influenced by Montaigne. However, we'll see that influence can come in a variety of ways, some of which are challenging to the initial position. Today, we're considering the incandescent life of Blaise Pascal.
Well, that was poetically said, the incandescent life.
Yeah, so we've talked about the book that sort of inspired this little mini series that we're doing, Why We Are Restless, and that's the phrase they use to describe Pascal in the book is incandescent. I think it's a really apt sort of description. So why don't you sort of explain that to us by giving us a brief biography of Pascal?
All right. So this is a man whose life burned like a comet, some writers say. The writers of the book you just mentioned that we've been reading, I'll say that very, very nicely. Others have said that about him. In fact, T.S. Eliot, the famous poet and editor, publisher of the 1920s and 30s, 40s, he wrote a preface to Pascal's book, Pensées, Thoughts, and to the English translation. He mentioned that commentary thing. So he lived 39 years old. You know, and if you and sometimes it's easy just to say that and glibly toss it off. But I think about that a lot. I'm 65. All the life that I've had between 39 and 65 has been probably the most important part of my life. And that doesn't have to be true for everybody, but just the perspective of how it would have been.
Yeah, that's very interesting, right? Because it's the same thing with me. You know, when they said that, I go, oh, wow. So that would mean I would have 4 years left to live, right? And I've talked about on the show before how it seems to me like I've lived a really long time, right? It seems like I've done a lot of things. And if I were to die tomorrow, said, 35, much less 39, I'd feel like I lived a good long life. You know, I don't have a whole lot of regrets. You never say none, because I think if you have no regrets, you haven't reflected on your life.
Yeah, agreed. Yes.
But very few, I think that I've had a good life, but you think about it, these different perspectives, and it really gives a different meaning to life. Cause I think that you're right. I haven't been there yet, but to me, it seems as though I can feel my life building to something greater and more important than it has ever been at any point thus far. And I think that those middle years are some of that time. So to not have that and still accomplish the things that Pascal did is really remarkable. But it makes you wonder what would have the remainder of that life.
What else might have come?
Yeah,
exactly. Because so here's someone who was, as you, a polymath, someone who was essentially entirely schooled by his father, or set up, so to speak, well by his father. A prodigy, he did prodigious work. He's 16 years old and he's changing geometry. He's changing mathematics at age 16, and probability theory. What were you doing when you were 16? One asks oneself. And it's a reasonable question, because I think sometimes, all of our circumstances are different, but sometimes we don't necessarily expect as much of ourselves as maybe we could.
This is a conversation that me and Amanda have had recently, talking about kids, right? Because I don't know if it's our day and age or if it's our actual age, right? But we don't have any kids. And so when we look at other people's kids, you tend to be struck by one of two opinions, right? You either say, oh, wow, like I can't believe they're letting that kid do that at that age. Or, oh, I can't believe that kid is still acting that way at that age, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's this expectation of what children are capable of given certain developmental milestones
And context.
Yes. And so, and there is, science behind that, right? Myelination of your brain, which is, the thing that helps you make connections and think in a efficient way, doesn't conclude until your mid-20s. So there's an argument for saying we need a graduated way of letting people develop throughout their early lifespan and not giving them responsibilities that they can't handle until they're old enough. But then there's also plenty of anecdotal examples of children being capable of remarkable things at very young ages. I think of I have a friend who he lives off the grid and he homeschools his kids, and they have a almost self-sustaining type farm and lifestyle, and you go over there and you just see the kids acting like small adults, right? And down where I have my 60 acres of property, there's a lot of Amish people. And you see the little Amish boys dressed just like clones of their fathers and doing the same work. And you can have reasonable conversations with some of these kids. And then you talk with kids of the same age in a different context, and it's completely different, right? Yeah. So I think that, yes, it is context dependent. It is age dependent. But I think by and large in modernity, we don't give children enough ability to grow and do the things that they are capable of doing.
No, we fill up. Well, this is we start talking about Pascal's biography. we fill their lives with mundanities when they are ready to explore the universe.
Yeah.
And not everyone, and I'm not talking about an overgeneralization of every single person, because there's obviously families that don't. But, it feels that way sometimes.
Yeah. I'll make one more comment, then we can get back on to Pascal. The friend I was just mentioning, right? I was talking to him about this same thing. And, we're specifically talking about how you'll see parents a lot, get annoyed by their kids asking questions and just tell them because I said so, or because, or, stop asking so many questions. And so, how kids come to abhor school, and he said, yeah, it's just a complete failure of the educational system because children are born curious and hungry for knowledge. You have to snuff that out of them, in order for them to lose that. And so it's interesting to look at Pascal because Pascal's life is almost the opposite of that, right? In the book that we read, they talk about how Pascal's father was so worried about the voracious interest that Pascal had.
That he sat on it.
Yeah, that he actually tried to withhold mathematics from him so that he would be able to learn about different things and not become consumed with his interest in mathematics.
Pascal and ended up doing math that he shouldn't have been able to do anyway. And then his father relented and said, okay, then I better guide you.
Yeah.
Right. So when your friend says educational system, we've talked about this before, but I just think it ties together a number of things. The educational system must be also the net that involves parents and how parents are with their children.
Yeah.
It's not just the system, but it's the parents that either encourage questions or don't encourage questions. And I can tell you as a grandfather, that makes all the difference.
Yes.
If a kid asks a question, you answer the question the best you can and say, I don't know, let's look it up.
Yeah.
That just is an amazing kindling for them.
And that's what I've told people on a couple of podcasts that I've been a guest on recently is, they've asked, well, how did you learn to do so many things? How did you become interested in so many things? And I tell them, my mom, right? Because my mom, developed a mindset in me that learning doesn't just happen at school, right? If you go to a museum and you say to a kid, wow, look at these dinosaur bones. Isn't that crazy? Before you know it, the kid will be reading every placard in the museum. It'll be And then that's education. That's a lifelong self-sustaining interest in the world, right? And that's the difference. It's not, we can't put all of the onus on what teachers are doing in school, right?
No, not that. No. Okay.
So we've interrupted ourselves. The biography of Pascal.
But that's, I think that just points to how interesting Pascal is, however we are about his positions. All right. So he's revolutionizing geometry in a sense when he's 16. And then he writes letters with a major scientist, Fermat. And so he's helping Fermat develop probability theory. This is in the 1600s, and which then changes the trajectory of what we come to know as social sciences and economics.
Yeah.
And that's before he's 20. So,
and the impetus behind that was mostly influenced by gambling. Trying to figure out, okay, well, if you're gambling and you want to figure out how to split your winnings before the game's concluded, how do you do it based on the position that the players are in the game? So that was the impetus for it, but it ended up having these cascading effects on science in the future.
Mm-hmm. And then he's an inventor. Mm-hmm. And so before his 20s, he invents a calculator
to help his dad try to figure out taxes.
That's right. And it was called Pascal's calculator, and then Pascalines. And I don't know, 8, 10, whatever. There's still some working ones that exist in museums, packed away so that nobody gets their hands on it. And we have to remember that he was doing this at the same time René Descartes was talking about mind and body problems, right? And so he's looking at natural sciences. He's defending he defends the scientific method, and that takes me to something we were talking about pre-show with a person who is in quantum studies quantum physics, but then shifts his perspective entirely. But yeah, scientific method. And he's a study of fluidics, the study of cones, conics, conoids, and vacuum. And then he's going on and talking about the idea of what a vacuum is and the space of vacuum. And it's like if we ever wanted a Tony Stark character, not for his morals and beliefs, but just this kind of iconic pop cultural, gee, now he's inventing this, now he's doing that. Here he is. He lived.
Yeah. And not for nothing, but he's credited with being the developer of public transportation.
Right. Essentially 5 pence, 5 cents, whatever the equivalent, ride for anybody in Paris with little carriages.
Yeah.
Because he thought people needed a way to get around. And you think about people today talking about, well, it can't be done. It can't be done. It'd be too expensive. Oh, gee, kid did it.
Right.
He's saying that just a young person 400 years ago could do this, 500 years, and you can't? Isn't that embarrassing?
Yeah. So Pascal was an exceptional scientist. Mm-hmm. When or why did he begin focusing on philosophy?
His sister, partly, who had become interested in Catholicism. And this is all very convoluted, but the essence of it is there were branches of Catholicism, of course, or heretical things going on that some Catholics would say was fine, but it's heretical if it's going against doctrine that others accept. And so there was a group of Catholics called the Jansenists, and they were essentially, this is way oversimplifying, but they were, in Pascal's view, they were lowering the bar for people to say, oh, it's okay if you don't have confession all the time. It's okay if you, if you have the vices, as long as you're right with God about the vices. Way too simple, and I admit it. But just to give an example of, and he thought that was hypocritical and casuist and sophist, and we've talked about that before, which means people would make any argument they could in order to get people on board with Catholicism. That's what he thought the Jansenists were doing. And so he was writing very cleverly. He wrote a whole bunch of letters from the provinces. That's the translation for the French, provincial letters. And taking the role of a person questioning various people, Jansenists, and so it's not unlike the Federalist Papers. It's not unlike the letters that Alexander Hamilton and so on were doing. Just poking the bear, and getting a lot of popular following from it. And of course, the church was not happy about it. And they were sending essentially church police out to knock on doors and, we know you're doing this. And meanwhile, he's got there in his house and he's got a manuscript hidden away, drying on the bed, because of course then you had to do manuscripts when you printed them, the ink had to dry somewhere. And so he's using a specialized kind of ink that would dry faster. And
it was this
very
huge
espionage like.
Yeah, it was a huge scandal, right? He had, it was very time dependent. It was the day of, he was doing this, and yes, he was using fast drying inks, and it was being printed at a secret location, and all of this stuff was going on. But yeah, his approach, I think, reflects some of the genius, right? Because what we were talking about before show, how there's some psychological research that indicates intelligence is closely linked with humor, right?
Right.
And colloquially, we refer to it as wit. And I think that is a good sort of term, because wit encompasses, it connotes both humor and intelligence, right? And I think in order to get this sort of point across, it would be important for that position, right? If you just start publishing anonymous papers railing against the Catholic institution, you might have some people that agree with you, but by and large, people are just gonna be like, oh, what is this is
who do we listen to now? Who do people? I've had many, when I was teaching, many students tell me toward the end they get all their news from Colbert and love it, and the comedians, right. Well, that's there's not for nothing. H.L. Mencken back in the 20th century, brilliance, satirist, wit, cynicism. People listen.
Yeah. And so an approach, right, it has a certain effect on the message, right? And if the message comes across as abrasive, it doesn't matter the merits of the argument, it is going to have a hard time reaching listeners. So Pascal, a lot of these were very funny, right? Yeah, I'm writing you a long letter because I don't have a time to write the short one. Right. Or, presenting just the case, okay, well, a priest can visit a prostitute as long as he takes off his jacket and does these sorts of things. And so representing some of the issues that the Catholic Church was having in a comedic light, really hit a note with me.
It hit a note, and he finally dropped the cloak and he said, "Yeah, I'm writing these." After it built up enough popular following, really, to do that, and he was writing his pensées, his thoughts, this formidable work, which we have the fragments of, and anyone, you can read it. It's available through the Internet Public Library. If it's not in your local public library system, and it's worth a read, because even though you might think it disconnected because of it's a fragment here and a fragment there, but even those fragments have a through line, and they give you some idea of what he's thinking. They also spur a lot of thought in yourself about some of these topics. But one of the things so it was an incomplete work. So we said, what would he have done if he'd gone on past age 39? He would have finished it. He said it was going to take him 10 years to do this book.
Yeah.
And if you think about that and say, okay, here's a guy who's done all these other things, it's going to take 10 years to talk about religion. He said all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone.
Yeah.
And when you think about, and I'm not extolling all the virtues of Pascal. We're talking about Pascal, but I'm not hero worshiping here. But these are things that I say. He has points worth discussing. How often do we talk about now? Why don't we put our cell phones down for a day? I have an old, dear friend in California. We were talking yesterday on the phone. Marvelous thinker, professor, dad, and we were talking about many things. And he said that his daughter at age 9 asked him, well, because he's not letting her have a cell phone. And she said, well, what age were you at when you got to have a cell phone? He said, 42. And he said the look on her face was, said, my dear, we didn't have cell phones. There wasn't an internet. There was a thing on the wall called a phone, and it had a dial on it and later buttons. And if you're lucky, it had a 12 foot long cord so you could sit at the dining room table or the kitchen table, but you couldn't have a private conversation. And mostly people traded information on it and gossiped some, and then they hung it up. And if it rang and nobody was home, it just kept ringing. He said she was gobsmacked.
Yeah.
She was just trying to, so I think that this is important. Because Pascal's not the only one who says this, but this goes back to the ancients, who some of whom would say, are you able to contemplate in peace? Can you sit and be with yourself?
Yeah, and this is very interesting, because I've been doing a lot of reading and listening to Zen Buddhist things, right? And that's essentially the breakdown of that, right? Is if you're, whether it's a koan or different types of meditation, it comes down to do you have the ability to empty your mind and then have this reflection on your place in the universe, and the difficulty in doing that some people who practice and become very good for 5, 7, 10 years don't have the ability to get to that point. And, I know just from, personal experience that, just trying to empty my mind for 20 seconds is a difficult thing, right? Without something popping up and being unable to let it pass by, right? Having it occupy that space.
And if it occupies the space, and this is what goes on with yogic work, if it occupies the space, well, if it needs to come front and center, you say, come front and center, and I'm going to talk to you. In my quiet room, and I'm going to contemplate why this is a problem. And the cat can cry and the horns can honk, but I'm in my room and I'm going to be thinking about this. It is difficult for people. He also said, and I love this, and I will not name names with this bully pulpit that we have, but this is so important at this moment in our history. Pascal said, men never do evil so completely and cheerfully as when they do it from religious conviction. And this is a man who was a staunch Catholic.
Yeah.
Who's saying a lot of evil is done by people who are in religion and proselytizing. I think that's very important.
Yeah. Yeah. You and I were talking before the show about how, the danger in religious conviction is the development of a fixed versus growth mindset, right? Once you believe that you have the answers and that the answers don't change, it gives you a different perspective on society and how you treat people, rather than if you're open to different avenues of information or the possibility that things may change.
So I've blown apart our entire lesson plan because we're talking about his biography and you have other questions. So
no, I think this is a good. The question was, when did he begin focusing on philosophy? And I think that we're talking about it, right?
Yeah.
We extolled his scientific merits at the beginning, and then we're talking now about some of his philosophical endeavors, which came about when his wife. Or his sister became a nun for a more conservative Catholic sect.
Yeah.
So Pascal was neither a rationalist or an empiricist. Do you want to explain to the listeners his, the philosophy of fideism? Is that right?
Yes. Essentially, and as I always say, this is oversimplification, just to put the idea on the table so you can read some more or ask more questions or talk about it. But there is an intuitive content, an intuitive process that is vital, according to Pascal. And part of that, when he says, I wrote it down here, that the heart has its reasons which reason knows nothing of. We know the truth not only by reason, but by the heart. He wasn't saying just go off and be blatantly passionate and emotional. He was saying that the heart actually offers its own intuitional logic, a rationality of a different kind. And that if we just blindly, with high passion and emotion, run off and do religious labor, and it can be detrimental to many. That one's faith, what you have to do is you have to run into the utter wall. And this is to answer your question. You have to run into a wall, and you have to acknowledge the wall and just go splat the way the coyote does in a Roadrunner cartoon. And that wall is that life is miserable. That the people who try to, the guys who run around and tell everybody, oh, smile. Why aren't you smiling? Smile. Barbara Ehrenreich wrote a book about this with people when she had cancer, and they're saying, well, why don't you have an upbeat attitude about this and smile? No, I'm not going to smile. This is not a joyous thing. That's a Pascalian kind of approach to say, you know what? The first thing that is required of people is to quit deluding themselves that the world is wonderful, because it isn't. Now, this is certainly, we know it came from his religious thoughts and his ability to just think so much through things. But he had much illness. He was sick a lot. He died very young. And so, that must have some effect on your life when you're constantly ill and wrestling with that. Yeah, life's miserable.
Yeah.
And if you don't admit it, and this is where he gets kind of, didacticism, really. If you don't admit the basics of life is miserable, then you're deluding yourself, and then your life is not going to have meaning. That if there's a meaning in the religious life, then it is in acknowledging that we're all miserable, we're all going to be miserable, and we just have to find our way through the misery to believing in something beyond, which is what Nietzsche later on was railing against about religion.
Yeah, it's really interesting from a psychological standpoint, looking at the whole thing, because, in psychology, there's a lot of emphasis put on childhood experiences and, more generally subjective experiences as a whole in terms of psychological processes. And I think that Pascal is really a good example of that. His mother died when he was very young. And then his father sort of had a roller coaster of a life, right? He had a high position. He sold the position and they were rich. Yep. And then the 30 Years' War happened and he became very poor. And then he worked his way back up into the king, so.
Yeah.
And then, like you said, Pascal was sick his whole life, right? As somebody who has been blessed with very good health my whole life, right? I know that just the littlest, most just inconsequential inconveniences in changes in health have a big impact on my mood and my outlook, right? Mm. If I injure, just straining a shoulder or a knee or something, and there's just 2 or 3 days where I can't do all of the active things that I normally do, that affects my psyche in an important way. So somebody who's very sick their whole lives, right? You have to imagine that's the ecosystem that they're living in. That's the lens through which they're viewing life. And so the fact that somebody like that would develop this sort of thought is not all that surprising.
My art teacher is an expert in Beethoven. She spent the majority of her her oeuvre, of her work, focus is on Beethoven. And Beethoven was a man of primal faith, but horrific things, horrific health, losing of the ear. Or we think about that Chris Hemsworth special again, and the young woman who, she may already be gone from this plane, because that was months ago, right? But who was, 29?
Yeah.
She didn't quite expect to get to 30. And to sit with somebody and ask them how they see life and what they're feeling about life when you do have the health and so on, you can't avoid that perspective being different.
Yeah, and that's the key word, right? Is perspective. How people are viewing life has a large impact on their philosophy, and that's sort of what fideism is about, right? This, like we mentioned, Descartes was a contemporary of Pascal, and they actually had some correspondence over various things. Pascal's work on hexagons and that sort of stuff. But Descartes was a rationalist. Hey, we can come to knowledge through rational argument. And then empiricism was also, on the scene at that time, which Pascal as a scientist engaged with, right? This idea that everything there is to know can be known through the senses, through experimentation, and
he says no.
Yeah. And he, later on in his life, he says, and that's the important point, is what you're saying, is that fideism isn't necessarily the disregard for rationalism or empiricism. No. He obviously possessed those through his scientific work, but fideism is that thought that that's not enough, right? That's not enough to know.
It's not enough to know. And this is a man who associated love with intellect. I sometimes go back to this Japanese ancient concept. I talked to a number of my students about it. I've read about it in translation in Japanese philosophy, but a thing called kokoro. Kokoro is heart-mind. Heart-mind is one. And I think quite probably without having, with the kind of life he had, I don't know, but quite probably not having had a direct contact with that concept. Nonetheless, I think that that's something of what was going on in him. So even with God, his search for God, he was saying that it's happiness isn't inside us. Happiness isn't outside of us. It's in God. God is inside of us, and God is outside of us. And so this difference with I think with Descartes is the mind-body thing. I think it fascinated Pascal too, but if you believe that within you there's this other being which was also outside of you, it's kind of a proto-transcendentalism thing to it. Go from 200 years later, that fills the space. So it's as if you're living with something else inside of you, which seems kind of odd to some people, but I think is what complicates the idea.
Yeah, because you and I were talking about it before the show, right? How it doesn't really matter what religion you look at. They all sort of succumb at a lower level to human issues, right? Mm-hmm. It's inevitable because we are human, right? Whether it's Christianity or Buddhism or whatever it is, people are people. So there ends up being gossip. There ends up being conflict. There ends up being controversy and, conspiracy and these sorts of things. But all of those things, don't invalidate the idea of this intuitive sort of knowledge, right? Which is what we were talking about beforehand, is even if you strip away any sort of religious overtones,
right.
You meet people throughout your life that you go, this person has something about them that is worthwhile. The way that they deal with life, the way that they deal with people, they know something that I want to know, right? And I think that's sort of that. I think that concept kind of encapsulates it a little bit, right? There's, could you create a rational reason for it? Maybe. Could you develop an experiment for why it's the case? Maybe. But the fact is, you didn't do those things, right? you could do them retroactively, but initially there's some intuition that there's something inside of you that has an ideal or platonic ideal of how to be a human,
and you're not going to utterly achieve it. You're not going to get to it, and that's what Pascal was saying. No, you can come to terms with this. The heart. He called it a heart-shaped vacuum. God is a heart-shaped vacuum, and you either come to terms with seeking to have God fill that, or not. But it's not then go out and tell other people it's and so live your life toward that thing that you hope when whatever transference happens. You don't know what's going to happen. Pascal said we don't know what happens after death. None of us knows what happens after death. No religion knows for certain what happens after death. They convince themselves. Go to the books and the books say, okay, well, books say lots of things. So I think Pascal's dealing with that and saying, but if you live toward this, that's the only thing that can sustain you in all the misery. First, you come to terms with the honesty that life is miserable. And this is the part where I have trouble with Pascal. But again, I see him a lot because of the shortness and the sickness and everything. If life is always miserable, then this isn't, what do you want to hang around here for? Well, you have to hang around here because you're having experiences that are then leading you toward God. And that tends toward that. Well, there's God will, and Pascal was fighting against this too, though. God takes somebody from my life. Okay, God, it was time for you to take, because that's what's determined. That's what you're. Pascal was not a strict determinist either, from what I can glean. But there's never a completion. And this is why we end up with Pascal's wager, which is sometimes, and the book pointed this out, people make a little bit too much of.
Yeah. Yeah. So, very interesting points, very interesting things you just said. I especially like that God is a heart-shaped vacuum, especially because of his work with vacuums, right?
Yeah.
And how he's railing against Aristotle and others who said that nature abhors a vacuum, right? Yeah. Well, the symbolism is there, right? And that flows through a lot of his work, right? And I think that's what gives him some enduring value, is that as a scientist and as a philosopher, I think that he was always attempting to honestly integrate those two in a way that spoke to a deeper human experience, regardless of whether or not you view him as successful. I think that intent was always there. So that leads us right into the next question, which was, what are some of the important highlights of Pascal's work in literature and philosophy? And we've talked about quite a few of them thus far, but not the big one yet. Right? So tell us about Pascal's wager.
Pascal's wager is, he essentially, as the book Why We Are Restless, I think the writers make a good point about this. This is not the beginning spot for Pascal. This is like the capper, the ending thought that he would offer to people. But this needs to be said in preface to that. He did not think that the pursuit of God was about knowledge primarily. If it were about knowledge, your mind would benefit from the perfect clarity of God, but it wouldn't get you there. What you had to have was the will. And I believe, as I remember, that the book says something about, well, this is like exercising. When you don't get to be in the shape, for instance, that you are, or your wife is by just saying, I want to be. No, you do it. And maybe it's not easy to do the exercise all the time, but then you do it and then you get there. It's where there's a will, there's a way, right? So it's about will. It's not about knowledge in and of itself. It's about the will toward it. So he's saying the wager would be with such a short life that we live relative to the universe. If you lived as if you believed in God, this is where it takes him really close to the Jansenists. Right? If you lived as if you believed and you did the things that you would do, then you've willed yourself toward that so that you actually just start habituating and doing that. And wouldn't it be better to do that and achieve whatever there is to be achieved with God at the other end of things, the other side of things, than to just throw it all away and say, no, don't believe any of it, and then pay the consequences afterward. I think it's a cheap tactic. I have always thought that was sort of a showman's tactic. Hey, but he's a probabilistic person,
right? Yeah.
If there's even a probabilistic existence of God, then maybe you should live with the will toward God. What he doesn't say is all the specifics, because he's not doing that. He's not saying, here's the chapter and verse of how everything you ought to do in order to get to heaven.
And that's where the danger in the position lies, right? Yeah. Because, living as if there is a God, or even belief that there is a God and therefore the life that comes from that can be all well and good if the principles that are espoused subscribe to a universal conception of virtue or ethics. But the problem is that doesn't exist in reality, right? So any conception you have of a universal ethical code or virtue has the potential to be used against you in a certain way. So saying, well, yeah, live a virtuous life, and then if there is a God, you're rewarded. Well, it depends on which God's at the end of that road, right? Because, there's a lot of people who are doing things today in the name of God and in the name of religion that are harming a lot of people.
Yes.
And
he spoke about that. The other thing I said, so it's not about doing that. And it's important that you're pointing this out, because it's not about do X, Y, and Z and you're going to achieve this. It's live with the will toward the possibility. And even if there's nothing, you have lived your miserable life better.
And this is where it gets really complex, right? Is because it sounds very much like a rational argument, right? The probabilistic statement of a rational argument, but that's what he was against, because that's what Descartes was. So Descartes was saying, well, I can establish a rational explanation that there must be a God, right? And Pascal was saying, no, that's not the point. He's saying it goes beyond that.
It goes beyond that. And this is there are people. I think Eleanor Roosevelt was one. If I might be apocryphal about this, but it's saying it's important to keep two opposite ideas in your mind at the same time. More than one person has said, okay, this is a chunk of quote, but I want us to hear it. And we stop at any point and talk about this. I think it's right on point with what we're saying. Pascal wrote, "It is dangerous to explain too clearly to man how like he is to the animals, without pointing out his greatness. It is also dangerous to make too much of his greatness without his vileness. It is still more dangerous to leave him in ignorance of both the vileness and the greatness. But it is most valuable to represent both to him. Man must not be allowed to believe that he is equal either to animals or to angels, nor to be unaware of either. He must know both." So he's asking for a lot, and I think if a lot more people, if we did this more honestly, and I'm not talking about getting religion, I'm just talking about.
No, I think what you're talking about is a state of mind that anybody who has engaged with philosophy or is a polymath comes to know, right? Which is humility. You know, the more things that you come to understand and the more ideas you engage with, and the more you identify the complexity in every idea and the merits and the drawbacks of every idea, the more murky and indistinct reality becomes in some ways.
Yes.
And that's what keeps you level, right? Just not engaging with anything isn't good. Yeah. Engaging with, thinking all the answers isn't good. Saying that there are no answers isn't good. You have to engage with the ideas and know that there's answers and know that in some ways you're special and in some ways you're insignificant, and have all of that knowledge in your head when you're approaching new conceptions. And it's a very difficult and humbling thing.
It is. Yeah. So it's not like about being great.
Right.
All the time. And it's not about it. And it is about coming to terms with our own vileness, which is what a lot of our history has been about. If we would just not beat ourselves up about it, but to say, yes, we've done this. This was wrong. But our culture doesn't have the capacity yet to do that. We haven't reached a Pascalian balance. And whether that is a religious or a spiritual balance or not, I think it's easy. It's easy enough to see how it could lead to that. It could lead to meditative value. It could lead to the humility you're talking about. And for me, that's what's useful in it.
Yeah.
Is to remind us. So, as you just said, we're murky. We're muddy. We're made of lots of elements and we have so much potential, but we also have both to do awfulness and to do good. And it's all in us, and we aren't just one way. There aren't good guys and bad guys.
Yeah.
There are people.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So obviously Pascal's philosophy influenced his scientific work. So how do you view him as integrating the two or sort of siloing the two in a lot of his thought?
In reading the translations of his writing over the years, I think I would go toward this seeming siloing of it. Because we just ran through that quick biography, which, a zippity-doo biography doesn't accommodate complexity, does it? But, first he did this, then he invented calculators. Yeah, but he was a person we just talked about the complexity. So he probably was still thinking about other things when he was doing the calculators and nonetheless, I think that the siloing, geometry and economics and probabilistic theory and vacuums. Okay. But then there's, a fusion of what all of those leads him to thoughts, pense about humanity. We are creatures who can create calculators. We are creatures who can create 30-year wars. We are creatures who serve in the National Guard and kill people. Humanity is all of these things. And I think that the siloed science, economics, the separate studies, lead to that integration.
Yeah, and I think that's sort of, I think it's reflected, obviously, right? None of us can actually silo anything, right? We're all influenced by different areas, but I think that it's to a degree with certain people and with certain concepts. And I think that is demonstrated by Pascal's life, right? Because he didn't care about religion before his sister's conversion. And then there was a turning point before the end of his life. I can't remember if his sister died before him or something took place where the last years of his life, he sort of disengaged with religion to some extent and started looking back at scientific things again. So, so I think that there was a bit of a siloing going on.
as much as we can, as you said. We're not.
Yeah. So, in light of that, do you think that would still be the case if he were living today, with the advancements we've made in science and with the global societal context within which we live? What do you think his thoughts would be like on the state of things?
On the state of things. Well, I think he'd be appalled, probably, and giddy with the fascination of what we have found out, and paralyzingly appalled at what we've done with it. That's what strikes me, because I don't think there's no reason to think that the humanity has abandoned misery. And if he thought the world was miserable then, I think it's clear that the world is miserable now from the Pascalian viewpoint. So I don't think that would change. When he said each man is everything to himself, for with his death, everything is dead for him. This is why each of us thinks he's everything to everyone. We know it's easy enough to see in culture voices that say this about themselves. We must not judge nature by ourselves, but by its own standards. I think he would say, look, the world isn't going to adjust to us. The climate thing, I think he'd be talking a lot about that. He'd be saying that nature's own standards are, you've done this to nature. This is how nature is going to be. How are you going to adjust to it? I think he'd be one of those voices that says, we're not stopping the climate crisis.
Yeah.
Where we have to figure out our way through this misery.
Yeah. Yeah. It's very interesting to think about, especially because one of his scientific background, but also, his philosophical background, with the advancements that have been made, what his thoughts would be.
Yeah, it would be fascinating.
But yeah, I think that
it's a great question.
Yeah, it's he never abandoned the scientific pursuit of things. And so I think with in light of the advances that have been made, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what his view would be, but
we run heedlessly into the abyss after putting something in front of us to stop us seeing it. The abyss, right? We run toward the abyss and we say, oh, look, it's as much as say one of that cartoon where it's a squirrel. Right? We're headed toward disaster because after all, we're miserable. But, oh, look, let's be distracted for just a moment. This will save us. Nope. We break through it and we're right into the abyss. I don't think that viewpoint would change given our circumstances.
Yeah, he might not be too surprised at where we're at all.
No, I think not.
So this has been a good discussion. We've set out what we established to do, which was looking at Montaigne, right, and his life and the merits of his work. Now we've looked at Pascal and his life and the merits of his work. And what listeners are probably noticing at this point is that the two are very opposed in their
Yes,
approaches.
Montaigne says, just live as quietly as you can. Take what comes in life. Nurture yourself. It's not bad. Don't worry, be happy.
yeah, exactly.
And because you're not going to fix everything. And it's better to just, live your life and take life as it is. And Pascal wasn't so happy about that.
No. So next time we get together, we'll examine the two philosophies and see what comes out of it. But until next time, keep